thank you for inviting me to the museum. It's been beautiful to hear everyone talking and kind of different ways you approach your work and kind of identity within this business that we do, emotional business. So, you might know me from Tents is what I'm known for. I moved through this kind of progression. I thought for this talk, I was kind of going to look at a linear progression of how I came to where I am. I work full-time as an artist. It's not easy, but how you kind of do that, and it's interesting to discuss those ideas of commercial, funding, conceptual context. I'm really starting. These are the kind of two things that converse in my work. So I did my BA at St Martin's, very conceptual. Painting was dead again, so you had to find a way to justify it. I was reading a lot about space, Merleau-Ponty, Gaston Bachelard, which stays in my work. But then I started at the Royal College and wanted to return to landscape themes, so I had my first year at the Royal College being really bad at landscape, just looking really rubbish, and doing my interim show and looking rubbish, but we went to New York. I was really excited about going to the Whitney Museum and seeing the Pollock. But around the corner in the Frick collection, I saw the Bellini. And this painting kind of moves through my practice all the time, and this conversation between spatial work and the figurative, and describing space and landscape, and not just illustratively, but thinking about the space that I inhabit, the space the painting inhabits, and the space that the viewer inhabits. So all my work is made for the viewer to inhabit it. So these are works I did when I left the Royal College. I was making massive paintings, and the idea was spatially, in order to embrace the viewer, the landscape had to be kind of human size. Obviously I end up on the opposite end of the scale. So I was making these really big paintings, very painterly. They stay spatial, they stay painterly. I was working with Agnew's Gallery. So Agnew's Gallery traditionally sold on masters, on master prints. They had a huge commercial audience that was ready-made. They decided to have a contemporary space, which they did, and I was one of the contemporary artists they took on straight from college, straight from my MA, selling out, making 18 grand in one show and thinking, wow, I made it, and then the gallery takes their cut. And then the gallery tells you, can you just make that painting again, like that one and that one. So I kind of very quickly found myself at an early stage in my career, very lost in terms of not knowing how I could continue my practice making the same painting for the next 50 years. So I started to embrace other things. This piece on the left is a piece I did with Bowie Art. Bowie Art, David Bowie's company that he was doing to engage with young artists. So I did an installation at Piccadilly Underground Station. It was a big kind of panelled thing with this idea of escaping through this hole in the wall into the landscape. But it's really nice that I showed this piece at the Whitaker Museum in 2022, and it's nice that it's survived all that time, but nice to reflect on a kind of long practice and not just feel old, but to understand the development. So as well, because I left the gallery, I left Agnew's, because I could afford to do that, but I actually couldn't, so I started working at an ecology centre in London. And I had my studio space. I was working with smaller galleries. I set up my own studio spaces. I was in those kind of groups where we built our own spaces. I made our own time. But this was a show I did with the Museum of London. So they had a small grant available through the London Arts Cafe. So I did this project with the Natural History Museum because I lived in Zone 2 in Clapton. We used to take the bus into London and see all of these trees and think about diversity and whether it got less in the city centre. So I started to think of landscape kind of physically and moving through it as a human. So on these little zeros, ones, twos, it's a really kind of analogue binary version of creating a bus route, a digital bus route So a 1 and a 2 meant there was a tree in it. So with this botanist from the Natural History Museum, we tracked the whole bus route. So that was really me starting to think about landscape differently. But in the end, I kind of stopped. I reached the point where I needed to leave London. I didn't want to be poor anymore, hungry, kind of worrying about every bill, every gas bill. So I left London, and I left art because it was so hard to survive, and not wanting the commercial, it not being part of my integrity and how I survived, I kind of thought, well, it's either or, so I'll go to work. I did a lot of jobs, so obviously I've been working at the Ecology Centre. I then started working with young adult homeless for a long time, which was a brilliant job. It taught me so much about working with systems and structures and vulnerability and giving and generosity, but also what an artist can bring to those roles and those kind of abstract ways of thinking and accepting people and accepting difference. So it was a brilliant role. I then went into a role working at an English heritage site, a scheduled ancient monument, which you can see on the bottom left. It's Langard Fort, which is on a peninsula, which is next to the busiest container port in Europe, and a triple SI, which is a scheduled site of special scientific interest of vegetated shingle. So I worked with all of these partners. I was part of a partnership, working with a historical site, working with English Heritage, working with Heritage Lottery funding. So all of a sudden I got thrown into this deep knowledge of funding and how to access funding and how to work with funding. I didn't know how I got the job, but I got the job to run an arts programme. I got the job because I've worked with difficult people. And that's because there was issues with volunteers and resisting the arts programme. So it was about delivering something difficult, which I managed to do. So I was delivering these arts programmes. That's a performance festival we did. We used to have these big events with reenactors. So I'd be in my office trying to do emails and people were firing muskets. It was just really interesting though, really interesting learning about all of that history. That's an artist crawling down a gun tunnel under a carpet. That boy told me he would not smoke in the scheduled ancient monument, but he did. So just stressful things like that. But while I was delivering this programme, I was thinking, well, why am I not doing that for myself? You know, now I know how to do it. Now I've got the answer. This is how you do it. So I started, but I'd left my practice behind for about 6 years. How do you paint again after that time? What do you do? And you know, that preciousness of that moment. And in the end, I made these tiny paintings, these tiny little sketches, these tiny little things which I just loved doing. And the joy of returning to painting was, it was just so emotional and so beautiful and so wonderful, and I knew that I wouldn't stop again, and that I could no longer have the barriers that I put in my own way through lack of ability, lack of confidence, lack of knowing how to manage my own practice. But also I was thinking about landscape as well, these little composite works, these tiny little things, thinking about these topographies, which being on this site with all these different things had made me think of worlds and all the different experiences of landscapes coming together as these tiny little things. And again, my life got shaken up and thrown out, you know, like with a roll of the dice. So I left my home, left my job, and then my dad died. So I'd moved to Sheffield, and this was one of the first paintings I made after my dad's passing. And there's a funny thing about my work. People often think it's to do with circus, and it becomes, I engage with the Fairground Archive later, but actually they're more about these transient structures in the landscape and these ideas of mourning, and the concealment of life and the concealment of loss, and loss moving through the landscape. So that was in John Moores in 2018, and I'd really only come back to working properly, to working in strong studio practice then, and I got selected for John Moores, which kind of made me quite hysterical with excitement. And then Contemporary British Painting. I then won the Contemporary British Painting Prize in 2019. So it was these things that were happening very rapidly, and I think they were happening because I had, it was an all or nothing moment in my practice, and I was like, this is all I'm going to do, and I was so focused and not focused on success, but focused on the actual painting practice and what I wanted to achieve with my painting and what I'd learnt in life and what I was ready to make and do. So this was Griselda Pollock writing about the work. She wrote for the CVP, there was an essay written about my work by Griselda, and it was beautiful to meet her, talk to her and have her write about my work. But she reminded me in that conversation that I grew up in the desert, which I'd kind of forgotten about. My earlier landscapes were about those kind of in-between spaces of desert, and how do you find that in a British landscape. But the tents become more and more about the desert, and it's not because of the kind of Bedouin tent thing, but it's about those kind of vacant spaces and that transience and that movement and that kind of lack of structure and grounding as a metaphor for our own lack of grounding. Again, you know, this idea of coming from something life-changing and difficult, something grows, and I think that's what you do as an artist. You translate the experience of the human through your practice. So, with my dad's passing, he was from Stoke-on-Trent. He grew up in the potteries. He worked in the potteries before he left. So, I learned ceramics. I started to develop ceramics as part of the grieving process. But part of the kind of, I wanted more narrative in my work, and I didn't want to do that in my landscape painting. So I was making these little things that looked like they were like transfer-wear, reflecting these transfer-wear, these kind of the printed procedure, but they're very painstakingly hand-painted ceramics. To that, I'm checking. I haven't checked my time. How am I doing? Am I halfway? Yeah. So then Harley Gallery. So we spoke about funding before and the accessing funding. So this was a DYCP funded. The Harley Gallery have a large collection of miniatures, and they kind of invited me to work with them. I won their prize. Now it's funny because I'm talking about prizes. I'm not interested in winning prizes, but it's the idea of entering them and having your work seen. You know, and I want to have my work seen, otherwise I don't know why I'm making it, because my work is part of the human experience and for the human. So anyway, they invited me to work with them. I had to apply for the grant. I applied for DYCP, but within that built-in mentoring for my ceramics, for my understanding of curating artefacts, my understanding of creation of artefacts. And it's an amazing site. It's a concealed site. You have hidden tunnels. You have loads of places that you can't access. And this whole terrain again is mysterious terrain. And then the kind of intimacy of things, this collection that the Cavendishes collected. These were the objects that were with Charles I just before he got executed. So it's this intimate touch of things, and kind of thinking about when I was making ceramics and the touch of objects, which is a kind of different thing than painting. I went on this tour in the Abbey because they still, the Cavendishes, the descendants still live in the Abbey. You get tours once a year. Ours was a bit late, so we were literally pelting around. Couldn't take photos, I was scribbling down stuff, but I saw this portrait and had to kind of work out who it was, and we worked out who it was, and I was looking at things like, oh, betting slips, I bet, you know, looking at all these sort of nosy little details. But, you know, so this was from a portrait of Mary de Medici, who died in kind of poverty, but I was really interested in this little black rosette around her neck, which, bearing in mind, I saw for about 20 seconds. But it was kind of combining that with the Charles I relics as they were, and starting to think of narratives and completely constructing narratives and presenting them as real, which I did in the final exhibition. Again, kind of mythologies created from these tiny little cartouches at the edge of the British Act of 1664, but beautiful. You know, it's like being a magpie as an artist and pulling things together into narrative and presenting them as real, as I did in the final exhibition. Was presented as a series of artefacts from a kind of made-up world that I created, and miniatures, and that little miniature shown in the Saatchi gallery on a huge great wall, and it's just a little dot, so there's no point showing the picture because it is a dot. But again, how things move through your own practice. So again, winning the New Light Art Prize with a piece that was this big, and that was during lockdown. Bearing in mind the Harley show I produced during lockdown as well in my bedroom. I'm not really sure how I did that. But then this piece, and this is when I'm really starting to mix these ideas of mourning with transience. And it was these kind of ideas of roadside shrines and the way they flourish perennially in the anniversary of someone's death or that something's happened. So it's like they reflower and then they die again during the year and reflower again. So I was kind of combining these. But from that came the shrines. So the shrines were first made when we very first came out of lockdown. Well, when we went into lockdown and then out again. So it was like January, whenever that was. And I was thinking about forests. I have a lot of forests in my family history. My family lived in Germany before I was born. So there's all these black and white photos of big dark forests. And they kind of entered my consciousness, as well as people talking about being in the landscape all the time, talking about being in the forest. And I was always really jealous during lockdown because I was just in my kitchen desperately making ceramics and painting for this solo exhibition. But they're really different. They're kind of really more like portraiture, so they face you. And these shrines are kind of accumulated, they're completely invented. And this idea of the human and the emotional constructing something out of the landscape. And as they develop, you know, the works I'm making now make the landscape the site of mourning. They kind of come back on themselves, so the subjects of the shrines and the landscape itself. This is Festival of the Mind from Sheffield, so I worked with an archaeologist. Again, this was another funded project of research with an archaeologist where artists work with academics. So I had a really wonderful time going around kind of different parts of Derbyshire, looking at different rituals, folklore rituals, going on archaeological digs, making work. I went down to the Rothwell Charnel. I was working with Jane Wildgoose, who runs a memorial library in London. And bearing in mind, so, you know, maybe talking about funding, I worked out this funding was available 2 weeks before it was due in. So I emailed the archaeologist and said, oh, I want to work with someone who deals with material culture. I emailed Jane Wildgoose and had it done in a week, because sometimes you just have to ask people and say, I'm really interested in this. Do you want to do this? And all they say is no if they don't want to, or ignore your email. But there's so many fruitful things that come from just so yeah, again, making these artefacts. These are a number of artefacts that came from the exhibition, reflecting all of these mourning rituals I was learning about. And again, thinking about curation of these and presenting artifice as real and what that means about the emotional response to that. Again, this was Jane Wildgoose. Her great-grandfather was a blacksmith, and he made this little frame, which I then built into one of my paintings of a shrine. And there's something very interesting about blacksmiths in kind of mythology that move between worlds. So I kind of like this project where all these tiny little details come together in one thing. You know, everything I do is kind of intricate and layers of detail to build the narrative. So Heavy Water. So we formed on the Freelands programme. That's me, Victoria Lucas, who introduced us, and Maud Hyatt Bavira. So they mostly work their sculpture and digital media, but we showed together on the Freelands, and it was how do you show some tiny paintings and ceramics with digital work without having a lot of rooms that are dark. So Angelica Sule, who was curating at the time, created this beautiful dark space. And I wanted to show my work in shrines, so they kind of illuminate it. We quickly discovered that we made work very similarly, even though the output is different. We had a meticulous level of detail and a kind of nuanced layering of the work, you know, bringing many sources together. We went on to do a work with Cardiff Special Collections and Kunstverhaus Dortmund, part of the Four Nations. That's after Brexit, so the Four Arts Councils of Britain funded a project to work with a partner from Europe to say, we still love you, we'll still work with you. But it was a really lovely project, a research project, starting to use drawing practice as a research tool. So making these composite drawings, ideas of the ruin from kind of 19th century scrapbooking, so really thinking about how you approach archives. And that's the other thing about Heavy Water is we came together because each of us works with collections, and we work with that as part of our practice. So a combined practice of working with collections is kind of beautiful, the conversations we have, but also working as a collective is really about efficiency as well. When you're doing a massive funding bid, if there's 3 of you doing it and not just yourself, the kind of democracy and efficiency of the collective is quite amazing. When you're on your own, you procrastinate a lot. When there's 3 of you, you don't. You just get it done. So collective working is kind of really beautiful, and Vic really respect their practice as well. So this is, Victoria curated this show at Graves Gallery. There's my piece that's in the John Moores that came from the research that we've done at Cardiff, and the General Cemetery as well. We did another project with that. So within that is inserted the vitrine of our collection of work. And it's a beautiful show about the female in nature and all of these conversations, and being able to show with Turner and Rembrandt and Ernst and all these kind of landscape heroes of mine. It's just wonderful. It's a really wonderful show, beautifully created by me. We have a website on the right, a digital publication, which is an ongoing archive of all of our research projects and the artefacts created. These are some of my artefacts. On the left, these are bombs, ceramic bombs that I made. But they're kind of mourning objects. They come from photographs of exploded sea mines, or exploded sea mines, and also that little rose is from some of my material mourning research. Fairground project, I'll just go through that really quickly. So I was invited by the National Fairground Archive to work with them because of the tents I paint and because of the fairground equipment I paint. So again, I put together a big Arts Council bid, and it's thinking, well, realistically, how should you pay yourself? And you're told to be paid this day rate as an artist. And it's like, well, you come to the point where you say, well, I want to be paid the day rate that you tell me I want to be paid, because we all do so much for free. And I'm not going to say there wasn't a lot of free time in that, but that was the development of my practice as well. But in collaborating with others, the importance to me is that it's not a box-ticking exercise, but it's actually something that's authentic, genuine, meaningful for yourself, for the organisation, and for the person you're working with. So I worked with a number of partners. Sheldon Chadwick, who is a 6th-generation showman, actually. Showman is a non-gendered term of the fairground community, which I'll go on to, and you can look at, I think it says it on another slide, but Sheldon is doing his PhD. We worked together, we had these beautiful conversations about landscapes, so it would have been very easy for me to just get a load of photos and paint some beautiful tents and sell a load of photos of paintings of beautiful tents, but actually it was more about this nuanced understanding of landscape, which I love talking to Sheldon about. I worked with a photographer who was with the Circus Group in lockdown. She'd photographed them, she'd got some funding for that. The person who set up the archive, a young person's group, looking at source material and then creating banners from that work. And a photographer, Bob Chase, this is me and Julie and Caitlin. I did a lot of kind of oral histories, which I hadn't done, so I learned how to do sound recording, sound editing, a lot of help from the archive, so it was a two-way thing. Painting. Bob Chase was a photographer, so I met with him. He photographs these showmen in the 70s because he lived in King's Lynn in the 70s. King's Lynn Mart is the first showman, that's the first fairground every season. It's on the 14th of February. Again, I just contacted him and said, I'm going to King's Lynn, do you want to come? He's like, yes, I do. So the other picture is contemporary showmen, really similar movements, even though they've got these big hydraulic machines. So we went back to find people, to see if we could find people for these pictures. King's Lynn Recording Exchange gave us a screen, so we sort of screened these photos, and it was this idea of a living archive. And I'm a landscape painter, I'm remote, I like to do things alone, but my landscapes are about people, and they're about us inhabiting and being absent as well. So when you do these projects, I get to do these other things that mean a lot to me, that I don't have to do in my paintings. So I can privately just paint, paint trees on my own. But yeah, so the bottom left is me with a lot of showmen. looking at this archive from the 70s of Bob's photos and finding people they knew, finding kind of dead relatives, finding pictures they'd never seen of themselves. This is Joanna when interviewed, that's him as a little lad with his sister, and then we made a living archive, we made a Google Drive so that people with a scanned QR code, so Showman can keep adding to that, so it will forever be adding their information. Had a series of events, panel discussion, I worked with architecture, you know, different architects, different community organisations, which I could talk about, but it would take too long. But there's a digital scan of the exhibition. There's all the oral histories that I made, and you can see that. You can listen to that. You can see that. I will have a permanent archive at the National Fairgrounds Circus Archive with all of this content, all of the voices of the showmen. The project was held up by the National Archive. It was in their case studies, their annual case studies, because of the level of engagement. And the level of engagement was because I loved engaging. It never felt like it was taking me from my practice. It never made me think, oh God, I've got to do so many workshops, you know, with just to tick boxes. It became such a huge part of the project. But I did have time to make paintings as well. So it's one of my ghost train paintings. And again, that's a very layered painting. So taking source material, it's got GT11 1980 to 89, because that's made from about 4 photos of the same ride, because I kind of construct things and I go through the archive to find them. And that's it. I'm exhausted. Just trying to picture the future it.
I mean, that is just such an unbelievable body of work, beyond painting also, I think. What do you want to ask, Joe, while we've got her here? My breath was taken by the painting yesterday because of the size of it and the intimacy of it and some of our personal experiences and using painting as a kind of way of dealing with that. But I think the height of it also, the way it was displayed, was very confrontational.
Yeah, they're kind of here, they're kind of a mirror or a reflection of your own kind of loss and grief, but then more and more they become about mourning for the landscape. So, you know, taking that process of your own mourning and reflecting it back onto the landscape. And as a landscape painter, you move through what is the natural. You know, the world's been in trouble for a long time, but now we're in this time when it's dying before us, around us, within us. You know, it has been for a long time. How do we mourn that? How do we translate that experience? And what's our responsibility? And it's that emotional response that I think, you know, statistics are one thing and you go, oh, that's terrible. But the emotional response and relating that emotional response to the kind of mourning for landscape, I think, is what I've tried to achieve in those works.
I think also a mourning for the human situation at the moment. There's little illuminations in it because you can see the copper coming through. And also the side of it is really beautiful because it's copper mounted on wood.
Yes, and I kind of, with that one, I waxed it. And
it feels like a beautiful object, like a relic, as well as then going back into the space of it and the beautiful copper illuminating from the back of it as well. So I think that is the perfect situation where it's amazing to be able to see people's works in this situation, but to see the painting and the real, there's nothing that compares to that. The smell of it, everything.
It smells good.
What does anybody else want to ask Joe? Anything?
Probably exhausted.
I'd just like to say, I think you've managed to carry on in practice while still engaging in stuff that interests you, which is really the best place to be, isn't it? Find a way to get paid for something you really like doing, that's connected to your work as well, and it all feeds in, and I just think it's really great that you managed to do that. It enhances both sides, doesn't it?
It does, because I get so intensely involved in things, I can't you just can't do it unless you're really interested in it, which is just so exhausting. It wouldn't be possible, I don't think. And I think that's what people forget. I think when you're looking at funding, you really need to understand it and how it relates to you, and never feel like you're kind of just clipping something on. Oh, I can do this, I can meet that. Yeah, I could probably, you know it. And the more authentic it feels, the easier it is, the more enjoyable it is. And you kind of, I think when you write about it in these terrible application forms, you know, my Arts Council form for this project was 96 pages long. And obviously they do it as add a box, add a box, add a box. And I think I got to write about the project in the first 50 words. And then the rest was, how do you meet this target, how do you meet this target, how do you meet this target, how do you meet this target? And they have since changed the form. That was like the worst point of the forms. And they've gone back to simplify it slightly. But you realise, and what you, with the Arts Council, you think, well, actually, this is government funding, and there's people going hungry, and there's people really, really struggling. So I'm an artist that's asking the government to give me money, so I need to be giving something back. You know, DYCP is one thing as, yes, we're going to give you the money to develop, and we trust that you're going to develop some aspect of your practice. But a project grant is, you are actually serving the community, you know, and I think remembering that, it's sort of quite touching, you know, and then you kind of put your work in between that, but it's public money, you know, and you know, working with the communities I work with, and coming from it in a community background, you know, I ran allotments and different things as well in between, and feeling a real commitment to community, and feeling that art can meet that, you know, it's not just imagined, we can do it as artists, and we need to keep trying. You know, it's valuable to your practice.
Yeah, it definitely feels as if you've embraced that now, whereas we can feel quite resistant to it, can't we? The questions feel sometimes like an intrusion, and I think I definitely thwart myself, like sabotage my applications on purpose, and I don't know what the reason, I've not worked out what the psychological reason is for that yet. Maybe I'm just not meant to make it work for me in that way yet, and I will. It feels as if you're really embracing it and have made it.
Yeah, I feel if you think the project is, you know, people have asked me to do things, and I don't think that that's the wrong person, you know, that I'm not the person, but, you know, but I think if you can make it feel authentic for you, then I think when you go through this arduous form and you think, oh, it's worth it, it would be worth it, because then I'll get to do this project, which I think is really cool. And I think that's it. Otherwise, you just feel really disgruntled and like, why do I have to do this just to do my own practice? And why aren't artists paid properly? You know, you're going through all of those questions, and it kind of thwarts you.
Yeah, that comes through.
Because you're just frustrated.
Okay, don't give me the money then.
Yeah, I don't want it.
I didn't want it anyway.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, but the way that you've talked about it is definitely a feeling of you've embraced that system in order to fulfill. You know, there's definitely, I think we feel we've got an integrity in what we want to do, but yeah, it's difficult to go through that process unless you maybe embrace it in that way.
And I find, because I'm fully self-employed, you know, to be able to compartmentalise your practice, so there's so many things I do are like, I'm going to do this because that's going to buy me 3 hours studio time. Do you know? And you're constantly, because studio time is the peak. For me, that's the top of the pile to be painting. That's the dream forever. So everything, I enjoy everything else, but everything is to build that practice and to build that longevity. Because I gave it up and I had those years in the wasteland, you know, and I don't want to have to go back there again. And I won't, you know, even if I'm drawing on a matchbox, you know, it's
I think those wasteland years
were brilliant,
You've given you the tools to understand community and understand how it is to run a project. So it all feeds in the end, doesn't it?
Well, that's what it is. If I had carried on, maybe stayed with Agnews, or maybe carried on, maybe I might be richer, I might be more successful, I might be more, people might know more about me in that regard, but there wouldn't be a richness to my practice and there wouldn't have been a depth of knowledge or the emotional understanding that I think you gain from working with communities.
I think that was one of my questions in the symposium outline. Not all of you will have seen that, but it was about what success means to us.
Yeah.
And I think that's quite a poignant thing to finish with this on. That yeah, it's how you measure that, what that means to you professionally as an artist. Thank you. Does anybody else want to ask anything? Thank you, Jo.